In March of 2010, the Jamaica Deposit Insurance Corporation, JDIC, staged the first Caribbean Bank Insolvency Conference at the Rose Hall Resort and Spa in Montego Bay. Over 20 experts from countries across the Caribbean, Canada, the United States and United Kingdom spoke on issues relevant to the global financial crisis, international initiatives towards best practices and resolutions for bank insolvency. In today's episode, we'll feature the presentation given by Senior Lecturer in the Department of Management Studies at the University of the West Indies, Jamaica, Dr. Jenifer Daley. Dr. Daley's address was entitled Thoughts on the Jamaican Banking Sector. You'll also hear from Patrick Loeb, the Director of Deposit Protection of Swiss Banks and Security Dealers. He discussed the topic of deposit insurance, the Swiss model. Dr. Jenifer Daley is a Senior Lecturer in Law, Accounting and Finance in the Department of Management Studies at the University of the West Indies, Jamaica. Dr. Daley is a Qualified Accountant and a Fellow of the Association of Chartered Certified Accountants.
Many views have been expressed on the events that occurred in the Jamaican banking sector, as we were reminded this morning. To date, there has been little convergence on the use of the term crisis, and if you go back to look at, or if you reflect on what the minister said, he might have used the term, but if you look back at Robin's presentation, he would have probably used the word distress. So there is little consensus on the use of the word crisis to describe the events that have occurred, and even less consensus on what the appropriate responses necessitate. However, what I will outline, since you have been reminded so in much detail this morning, are just a brief architecture of some common core of recommendations which concurred on a number of desirable steps that we should take coming out of that crisis. One, it was suggested that there should be a reduction in the number of banks and branches in the Jamaican banking sector. Two, it was recommended that banks' efficiency be improved. Three, there was a need to address the apparent anomaly in the poor credit assessment and risk management practices and weak internal controls of the locally owned banks relative to their foreign-owned counterparts. Four, addressing the apparent anomaly in the greater tendency to illiquidity and insolvency of locally owned banks relative to foreign-owned banks operating under identical macroeconomic and institutional conditions. Five, addressing the generally poor quality of management in locally owned banks, since even local managers operated at a higher level in foreign-owned banks. Managers in locally owned banks, it was suggested, seem to have been inflicted with what was called loophole mining, which is avoiding the law at all costs, an edifice complex, which manifested itself in ostentatious buildings, and nepotism. Six, the prudential regulation and supervision framework should be enhanced, addressing regulatory weakness and forbearance regarding, for example, conglomerate contagion and intervention in weak banks. Seven, establishing set procedures for handling crises, and eight, mitigating the effects of a poor credit culture by the establishment of a centralized credit referencing agency. Of course, if we take steps in these directions, it is likely that Jamaica's risk of crisis would be reduced.
Perhaps it is still not too late for us to consider why some of these steps were not taken earlier, and if some great obstacle is to be removed, whether it has been done since the 1990s or how it will be done in the future. But for the period between 2003 to 2007, any productivity gain was mainly by technological progress. The second largest banks, merchant banks and locally owned banks, showed significant productivity growth in some instances, with more modest growth for commercial and foreign-owned banks. The traditional ratio analysis suggests that, on average, larger banks, commercial banks, and foreign banks reflect a lower level of efficiency than smaller banks, merchant banks, and local banks, respectively. The level of competition in the banking sector of an economy has a major impact on consumer welfare and economic growth through its influence on bank performance. The liberalization of the Jamaican economy in the early 1990s, the experience of financial crisis in the mid-1990s, the enhancement of information technologies, and proposals for a CSME are expected to have contributed or will contribute to significant changes within the sector. The crisis of the 1990s should have left an indelible impression in all our minds of the value of an ounce of prevention. Banks cannot effectively support economic development if they're not productive, if they're not efficient, and if the level of competition among them is detrimental to customer welfare. Deposit insurance is good, but depositors must never be allowed to think that because of the presence of deposit insurance, they have no responsibility in terms of how they conduct themselves. In recent years, Jamaican banks have been challenged by the effects of unregistered financial organizations, or as someone called them earlier in the conference, alternative investment schemes. Few would argue that market discipline is a critical ingredient to financial stability, but in this instance, it appeared as if the market itself was in need of discipline. How far can and how far should regulators or governments go in depositor protection in such an environment? I conclude this highly selective review by acknowledging that there is clearly a need for continued dialogue on these issues. But the reality is that we've talked a lot already. More significantly, there is a need for purposeful and decisive action. Hopefully, this conference will provide the necessary fillip to the efforts. Undoubtedly, there is a need for more research on critical banking issues, and these must be made available for general public education. Research and public education are critical if the sector is to effectively compete in a globalized economy.
Patrick Loeb is the Director of Deposit Protection of Swiss banks and security dealers. He also has responsibility for consumer affairs and real estate matters at the Swiss Bankers Association.
The Swiss DGS is a self-regulated entity, and that means it is basically ruled by the banks themselves. Or in other words, every institution holding a bank license or a securities dealer's license has to be mandatory member of the DGS. That brings us up to 400 members currently in Switzerland, and it works very well. The payout procedure is based on two pillars. It's therefore a two-step procedure. We like to have the failing bank or the failing institution paying their debts or paying the depositors. The Swiss DGS would provide liquidity for the rest of the deposits which could not be covered by the liquidity of the failing bank itself. The remaining secured deposits up to a level of 100,000 Swiss francs, which is currently about $100,000, so that makes it easy, or 70,000 euros, which is for us, in the European perspective, a more vital element because we always compare with our peers in the European Union, must be paid out within 3 months so far. In Switzerland, we have here as well the another two elements added. We have 325 billion deposits which are guaranteed. The cap is at 6 billion, which comes up roughly to 2%, which is a quite regular number compared to other DGSs. Out of these 6 billion as a cap, 50% have to be held as an extra liquidity, meaning the banks themselves have to have 50% of their liability on their books, which they cannot use for any other purposes. Within Europe, ex-post financed DGSs are challenged. But based on the liquidity provisions, the Swiss law asks Swiss financial institutions to have. The Swiss Finance Ministry, as mentioned before, came to the result that in this case, the liquidity provided is sufficient and therefore an ex-post financing is safe and sound. On the first level, we have a payout of the preferential or the guaranteed deposits using the bank liquidity. On the second level, we have the ex-post financing of the remaining assets through the deposit protection. And on the third level, we have the payback to the deposit protection after liquidation of the bankrupt bank for the amount of money paid through the deposit protection. The biggest controversy we are right now looking at is the so-called pro-cyclical effect of the DGS we are having, of our DGS model. And you probably know, when we talk about the pro-cyclical effect, that means that in the time of distress or crisis, the banks have to provide liquidity for a failing institution, or if things come worse, even for more than one failing institution when they are struggling themselves. Now, that argument is definitely a vital one, but unfortunately, we haven't seen a model where the procyclicality is not an issue. The future challenges for the Swiss DGS are clearly the reduction of the payout term, and we will clearly reduce that to 20 days within the next 12 months. Prior, as I said, 90 days. Another big issue, and probably a little bit the Swiss speciality, are the dormant accounts, based on the fact that we have a lot of foreign customers. Our banks have a lot of foreign customers. So far, we have not been able to, for example, provide financing for a bridge bank. This will change as well in the year 2011. Personally, I think we should strongly consider a hybrid system, meaning having a considerably low fund with a low number of cash in it, but cash available, which makes a lot of sense towards the consumers. So, in order to conclude, one can say the Swiss model is a cost-efficient system providing liquidity, but it is not a premium-based insurance model.
In our next episode, we'll bring you highlights of the addresses delivered by Risk Assessment Insurance and Liquidations Officer at the Deposit Insurance Corporation of Trinidad and Tobago, Noel Nunez, and the Honourable Justice Ian Kowali of the Commercial Court in Bermuda.